Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today's guest is a writer, producer, and director who's brought us some of the most iconic and enjoyable movies of our generation, including The Best of Times, Blaze, White Men Can't Jump, Cobb, Tin Cup, Play It to the Bone, Hollywood Homicide, Just Getting Started, and of course, the film that is widely considered to be the best sports movie of all time, Bull Durham, which earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Screenplay and the New York Film Critics Circle Award and the Writers Guild of America Award for Best Screenplay. He also received numerous film festival nominations for his screenplay for the political drama Under Fire, starring Nick Nolte and Gene Hackman. He's worked with many great actors, including Paul Newman, Kevin Costner, Susan Sarandon, Robin Williams, Morgan Freeman, Harrison Ford, Wesley Snipes, Woody Harrelson, Tommy Lee Jones, Kurt Russell, and of course, his wonderfully talented wife, Lolita Davidovich. Most recently, he's written a fascinating and entertaining book entitled The Church of Baseball: The Making of Bull Durham, Home Runs, Bad Calls, Crazy Fights, Big Swings, and a Hit. The book takes us behind the scenes and tells the story of the conception and making of the film, as well as giving us an insightful primer on the art and business of movie making. I'm delighted to welcome Ron Shelton to our show. Ron, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I'm delighted.
Ron, I absolutely loved your book. Tell us what inspired you to write it.
It was an accident. Really, I had no intention to write a book about a movie, about any book, but especially about a movie made 35 years ago, which seemed like I would be living in the past. But the introduction to the book explains what happened. A lot of misstatements had been written about the movie. And I'm always asked about the movie and asked to talk about the movie. I made a trip to Durham for the 30th anniversary of the movie, where they were trotting me around like a hero. And at the ballpark, and I tell the story that I was doing a Q&A with the fans before the game in the big stadium, new stadium. And a couple said, "Could we take a picture with you?" And our two sons, we moved to Durham because we loved the movie so much, which I thought was pretty strange, but fine. I was taking a picture with him. And as the picture was about to be taken, I looked at the 10-year-old and I said, "What's your name, son?" And he said, "My name is Crash." And I looked at his younger brother and said, "I'm afraid to ask." And he said, "Yep, I'm Nuke." And I thought, well, oh my God, if people are naming their kids after these characters all these years later, I think I better write a book about where this all came from. And that's the genesis of the book.
There's a miniseries called The Offer about the ordeal that Albert Ruddy went through to get The Godfather made. I think your story of everything you went through to get Bull Durham made would also make a great miniseries. What do you think?
Well, I think people may be getting tired of the stories, but at least Godfather had blood. Mine didn't have blood. Mine just had tears and laughter. But many movies have difficult births, let's put it that way. And when I was getting great response from my first draft of the book, well, the only draft of the book, I asked the editor, "What is it? What are people connecting with?" And they said, "Well, it's a very personal story, and your point of view comes through loud and clear, but it's the only book ever written about a movie from its inception of the idea, through the writing of the script, through the selling of it, through the casting and the pre-production of it and the shooting and all those nightmares and the editing and all the way to the marketplace by the guy who did it." In other words, there's been third parties write these stories, but never from the filmmaker's point of view, which I didn't realize at the time. So I think there's maybe something very unusual about that. I'm able to tell you what's going on in my head and what battles I'm fighting and what I'm trying to figure out along the way.
Ron, when you were 10 years old, your grandmother took you to see a movie called A Man Called Peter, starring Richard Todd and Jean Peters. You wrote that the illicitness of the darkened theater and a deep red curtain drawn to reveal larger-than-life images accompanied by an orchestral score was overpowering. What was it about cinema that made you fall in love with it?
Well, first of all, because we didn't get to go to movies, it had a special power. Whereas if I went to a movie every week, like some kids did, it would have just been ordinary to me and part of my daily bread. But the grandness of it, the size of the theater, the size of the sound, and the fact that we weren't supposed to do it all added up to something irretrievably impossible to avoid and to be drawn to.
Ron, when you were in high school, you used to sneak into movies, and one of your favorites was The Hustler, starring Paul Newman. And then in 1989, you got to direct Paul Newman in Blaze. Tell us what it was like to work with one of your idols.
On one hand, it's strange because now you're breaking bread with him and talking about script with him and lines of dialogue. And he's this icon that has to come in the back door of restaurants and have a private table or he's swamped. I think, as everybody has said about Paul Newman, he's very shy and very insecure. And his memoir just came out, which I had the same publisher as me. And so they showed it to me a year ago. And I said, yeah, that's Paul. I mean, he was very insecure, as many superstars are. I think his stunning good looks made him more insecure, not more secure, because it made him feel like he's only a star because of the way he photographs rather than from his talent. So, and I don't think he ever quite made peace with that. Most big stars are insecure, I think, in some ways, not all, but most are, because they realize that they're but for the grace of God, that they're lucky, that they've been chosen, and that there's equally or more talented people who become character actors who can play anything, and they can only do one thing. He was generous, he was sweet, he was shy. He would rather rehearse than do anything. He would rather rehearse than shoot because he comes out of that method acting in New York. I quite liked him, but when the movie was over, we had very little contact. But every director that ever worked with him said the same thing.
Yes, that is definitely his reputation. Now, you've written and directed a number of films. When you're directing a movie that you've also written, do you ever have a conflict between Ron Shelton, the director, and Ron Shelton, the writer?
Well, that's a good question. And the answer is all the time, Harvey. Sometimes I'll be directing a scene and say, who the heck wrote this thing? It's not working. And I'll joke, I need a writer. Somebody find me a writer. Well, the good thing is that I generally know how to fix it if it's not working on the spot. It's also why I like to rehearse, so you don't get caught off guard on the day of shooting. But there's inevitably things that happen on the day of shooting that are unanticipated. And sometimes they're bad, but sometimes they're good. Sometimes the scene will go in a direction you didn't anticipate. And you can make a couple line changes and go with it. Maybe a scene is playing darker than you thought, and it's really resonant. And you go with it, or it's lighter, and that liberates the darkness. So I think being a writer director is helpful, although sometimes the writer fails me as a director.
I want to ask you about your directing style, Ron. You wrote that knowing when to get in and out of a scene is a separate discipline, and that scenes turn because they have a life of their own. What did you mean by that?
A scene in a movie, in my mind, almost every time has to change direction somewhere, or else is exactly what it's going to be at the beginning of the scene, which doesn't create drama. In other words, when it's done well, and in good movies, it's done well all the time, you don't even realize it. It's not like a body falls out of a closet. It's just that suddenly something happens that changes the motivation of the character, or the direction of the story, or even the plot, or just the relationship, so that the scene ends differently than it starts. That drives us into the next scene. If a scene is the end, when I read a script from a beginning screenwriter, often these scenes end the way they start. That's not drama. Jack Nicholson once said that when he reads a script, he's looking for scenes that turn, that have a change of direction in them. And I've always believed in that. And I think good writers are just intuitively trying to give scenes turn. I think it's the problem with a lot of scripts that don't turn. If you take 3 scenes back to back to back to make a turn, it's not as dynamic as if the turn happens in the same scene. So every scene I write every day, and when I get off of this, I'll be back in the script. I'll be asking myself, what's the turn here? The direction. And that's what makes great storytelling.
Before we get to Bull Durham and your amazing book, I must tell you that last year we had Ernest Hardin Jr. on our show. He was in White Men Can't Jump, and he's a very dear friend of mine. He said that you loved his jump shot, and he asked me to say hello to you and to tell you that his jump shot is still really good.
I love Ernie, and Ernie was a great shooter. And then when I would say action, suddenly he wouldn't make the shots. And I would call cut, and I'd say, Ernie, you never miss a shot until I say action. And he said, Coach, that word action is I can't say it on the air, MFer. So that became kind of our slogan for the movie, that everything's easy until you have to do it on camera. I love Ernie. I'd love to work with him again.
Oh, I know he'd love to work with you too. Now, turning to Bull Durham, the description in your book of your meeting with Tom Mount, the producer, is absolutely fascinating. You were pitching what eventually became Bull Durham. You definitely have an extraordinary talent for spontaneously coming up with concepts off the top of your head. Where does that improvisational creativity come from?
Probably trying to survive, you know. I mean, I was 40 in my 40s before I got a directing job. I was in my mid to late 30s before I got any kind of a job writing. I did jobs my whole life, scrambling to pay the rent. So I think I've sort of improvised my life, to be honest. I also think being an athlete professionally helps you with that sense of spontaneity, because you prepare, and then now the game is on. Your preparation doesn't matter. It's how can you respond in the moment to something that happens differently than you prepared for. So I believe in preparation, and I believe in spontaneity. And I look, and to this day, if I'm pitching a story to a network or a studio, sometimes in the middle of the pitch, I'll have to change direction when I realize what I came in here to sell, they're not looking for, but there's a seed of some idea that maybe I can turn on its head and sell it. So I just have to make sure I don't sell something I don't know how to write. But I think it's survival and athletics.
Kevin Costner had just done The Untouchables and No Way Out, two massively successful movies. And yet, even with him in your cast, you had enormous difficulty getting financing and support for Bull Durham. You were turned down by almost every studio. Why do so many studio executives have such little sense of what would appeal to the public?
Well, I think any time you have a project that doesn't fit the paradigms, that doesn't look like every other movie, they get nervous. I was a first-time director. Nobody had ever done a movie about minor league baseball. Nobody hit a home run in the ninth inning to win the game. There was no big game. The two guys it's about aren't even on the team anymore. He gets released. There's this crazy woman telling the story. I don't think she's crazy, but she came across that way. And by the way, just to amend your comment, No Way Out opened to great reviews in the New York Times on the last day that Kevin Costner was committed to Bull Durham. And that got the movie made. Had No Way Out opened the following week or got bad review in the New York Times, Bull Durham never would have got made.
Wow. Your insights into what actually happens in a baseball game, on a baseball team, and how that all relates to the story is brilliantly interwoven in the book. As a fan watching a game, we tend to focus on the play being made, the score, the athleticism of the players. But the reality is that on the field, the game is much different from how we fans perceive it, correct?
Yes, the fans are watching one game and the players are playing a different game, because the fan is not aware of, nor should be aware of, the personal crises in the players' lives. These are young men, very young men in the minor leagues, 19 to 25, with marriages failing, relationships failing, parental issues, family issues. In my day, Vietnam was hanging over everybody's head. Civil rights movement was raging, and the sex, drugs, rock and roll era was going on. We were all terrified of being drafted into the war, and if your batting average fell to a certain level, you get released and you get drafted. I had friends dying in the war that I played ball with as kids. There was so many things going on in that era, the late 60s, early 70s. And it's true today that the issues aren't as in your face, but these are young men. And you go from high school or junior college or college to making your living as an athlete on the road. It's quite a jump, and it's highly competitive. It is a Darwinian dog-eat-dog world.
That's for sure. I know that writing the plot of Bull Durham was quite a convoluted process. You said that you were well into Act 2 and you still had no plot. You had friends telling you that if Crash didn't come back, they would never speak to you again. Did you ever seriously consider not having Crash come back to Durham?
Well, the first draft, this is the first draft with a few revisions. In the first draft, he left and it ends on Annie's kind of monologue about tomorrow's another day, which is the classic ending to the American novel. That's Gone with the Wind, but it's also Huckleberry Finn. It's also Catch-22. It's the American belief in tomorrow, naively, optimistically, whatever, however you interpret it. And I left it open-ended, and I gave the script to half a dozen friends, and they said, "We love the script, but Crash has to come back or we'll kill you." So I said, they're right. Crash has to come back. It's a love story at the end of the day. But other than that, I really didn't make any changes from the first draft to the shooting.
Ron, when I was reading your book, I was amazed by the number of things that went wrong or got fouled up during the shoot. The costume designer and production designer got into arguments. The front office wanted you to replace one of the main characters midway through the filming. The weather went sideways. The ball players weren't allowed to eat at the catering truck, and a myriad of other things. You wrote that the job of a director is crisis management, and your style of crisis management is athletic. What did you mean by that?
Well, sometimes it's too athletic. As you know, I got into a fist fight with the producer, which I regret, and I talk about regretting, but it was quite volatile and physical. But mostly, I mean by athletic is when you make your living as an athlete, there's good days and there's bad days. And in baseball, as the old saying goes, if you fail 70% of the time, you're one of the greatest players who ever lived. So that means you're hitting 300. So what you have to do is keep your head about you, your wits about you, not get too upset on a bad day and not get too high on a good day. And in filming, it's very much like that. You have a scene you shoot that's very hard to shoot and you don't think it works. And are you going to figure out how to get another day back to shoot it? The studio's not going to give you the money. You're going to have to cut other things and make a trade, but you got to stay cool-headed. You got to keep the actors focused and confident. And on a day that's exhilarating because you know you just nailed it, you don't go out and party. You just say, what do we shoot the next day? So that's the athletic model of showing up to work completely prepared every day, dealing with the crisis, expecting the crisis and not to be bothered by it.
Your book is such an eye-opener into the mind-boggling process of turning words on pages into actions on the screen that captivate the viewers. And you also describe the torture you were put through by the studio during post-production. How in the world, Ron, did you maintain your sanity through all the endless test screenings with the studio breathing down your neck the whole time?
Oh, well, I drank a lot. Sometimes that's I found that to be quite comforting. Close friends. Look, at the battles with studios are common. This just happens to be mine. I've had movies where there weren't any battles and the movie was a big hit, and movies where there weren't any battles and the movie wasn't successful. So you're expecting battles. I think what was odd about this movie is the battles we were having seemed to not be battles worth having. They wanted to fire one of the actors. They wanted to fire me. They didn't think the meeting at the Mall was funny. They didn't think Susan looked good. I mean, how can you not think Susan Sarandon looked good? This was a 40-year-old woman, and nobody was giving 40-year-old women leads in movies. And I was, because I thought 40-year-old women were more interesting than 20-year-old women. and had more stories to tell. So that was the problem. I'm used to fighting studios and networks. It just, on this one, I couldn't understand what they were talking about.
I love your story of how you filled the stands for the filming of Jimmy and Millie's wedding. I'm not going to go into it here because I want people to get the book and read it for themselves. But I want to tell you that next time I watch the movie, I'll be looking for all those Pink Floyd t-shirts.
Well, they're in long shot, so you can't tell. But if we'd have gone into a close-up, you'd have seen them. I'll let people discover it in the book.
Your chapter entitled Kill Your Darlings is a common theme I've heard from every director I've interviewed. In Bull Durham, the scene with Annie and Crash in Murphy's Tavern, where she reveals her backstory, was a scene you felt was essential to the movie, but you ended up cutting it. Why?
Well, there's a whole chapter, as you say, called Kill Your Darlings, that prints the scene, so you can read the scene. And I think a lot of directors came to the conclusion I did, is sometimes the scene that is the reason you wrote the script isn't needed because you've told the story in all the other scenes. And it's either redundant or it's giving you the audience information they don't actually need. In this case, I discovered that Susan telling her, as Annie Savoy, telling her life story about how she came to discover baseball, gets into her background and her parents and her lost parent and her kind of search in life for something missing that took her through all the major religions and most of the minor ones, and it has led her to baseball. And baseball, in truth, starting to not work. That there was such intimacy between the two of them. It was the kind of sharing that you don't do on a first date. and she was brilliant in the scene. That was the hardest thing to cut. And that there was such intimacy that in a certain way the movie was over. You know, there was still story to play out. They weren't together yet. They hadn't, had a night together to get, and Nuke was still in between them. There was issues that needed to finish. And that was my conclusion, that the audience knew they would be together, and the air went out of the room. And it had nothing to do with the scene. The scene was great. It had to do with the whole, it hurting the whole. That's the conclusion I came to, and that's the conclusion that many directors seem to come to when they cut their favorite scene out of the movie.
When you look at the incredible impact that Bull Durham has had, not only on the millions of fans who love the movie, but the city of Durham, North Carolina, are you surprised the movie resonated with people in such a big way?
I'm stunned, honestly. I mean, I'm thrilled, but that we're having this conversation all these years later, what was unimaginable when I was just trying to stay on schedule and not get fired. And then the movie didn't test screen very well, as I point out in the book. And I just wanted it to be successful enough that I could make another movie. And I was just trying to survive, like those ball players in the movie, and go to the next step. So I've spent time, I talk about in the book, trying to figure out why it's resonated. I've come to the conclusion that, as somebody once said, Crash loves something more than it loves him back. In this case, it's his job and the game of baseball. And he deserves better. He's not going to get better. And we all probably have loved something or someone more than it or he or she loves us back. A job, a person, a family member, something has just not worked, and we've given our all to it. And I think that might be the universal in the movie that I was completely unaware of when I was making it. And plus, Annie is her own version of that. She's kind of sexy and funny and entertaining and colorful, but in a certain way, she's still playing with boys like Crash is. And there's a point at which you have to say, I mean, this is the, not to be pretentious, but this is, Henry Ford Part 1. This is Prince Hal leaving Falstaff. There's a point at which you can't hang out in the bar with the ball players. And if you're, you really want to be going to bed with 19-year-old boys the rest of your life. And so she has a come to Jesus moment too. And they sort of run into each other at these moments in their lives where they have to change, and change is risky. And that's what the movie's about.
Do you think, Ron, that given the political correctness that's so prevalent in Hollywood and the rest of the world right now, could a movie like Bull Durham be made today and have the same flavor and charm?
Great question. I hope so. I don't know. I I think we have to push back against a political correctness run amok. Let me put it that way. I think when political correctness began as a term, it was socially useful, that we were all being too casual with some of our language and needed to pay attention to the power of words. And now it's become kind of a thought police, which I am against. I grew up, as the book says, in a conservative church-going family. I'm very politically liberal now, but I'm not crazy. I'm not extreme. More of I would call us a liberal centrist who believes in the freedom of speech, but that you can't, what upsets me, this is a sidebar, is that we're not allowed to disagree openly as much as we should be, that I can take an unpopular position and not be castigated for it, and that you can, and that we can. Why can't we break bread together and have different points of view together? And this is true of both sides of the political spectrum. This is the extreme on both sides, that we're prejudged for things that are simple-minded. And that's my speech. I'll get off the soapbox, but I hope it could be made, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not either. Now, in the late 60s, you played minor league baseball with a number of teams, including the Bluefield Orioles, the Stockton Ports, the Dallas-Fort Worth Spurs, and the Rochester Red Wings. And in 2017, you were inducted into the Rochester Red Wings Hall of Fame. That must have been such a special moment for you. Congratulations, Ron.
Thank you. And I got a bobblehead. That was what I was moved by the bobblehead. One half of it was a film director, and the other half was a baseman. And I always thought bobbleheads were silly until I got one. And I thought, this is one of the great things that's ever happened to me. So plus I could take, what was interesting about that to me, because I've been with my wife, Canadian Lolita Davidovich, from London, Ontario to Toronto. And I could take our son, who was a high school baseball player. They weren't part of my life at that time. And so I could take them to Rochester and they could get a glimpse of what that world was about. And we drove down to Cooperstown, New York, and the Hall of Fame. And because that was a different lifetime for me, and they weren't part of it, and they could get a glimpse of it. And that meant a lot to me. And reading the book as I wrote it to them was very meaningful to me, because it was all like, wow, this is a whole universe we didn't even know about, because I don't talk about it, plus I wrote a book about it.
Why, I'm very interested to hear you say that, because as I was reading the book and learning about your experiences as a young ball player and how those experiences informed your writing of the screenplay, I got the feeling that for you, the process of writing the book was a kind of journey of rediscovery of your youth and the highs and lows you felt as a player. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it was also cathartic. Making the movie was cathartic, because after I quit playing ball, I really couldn't look at baseball for a while, because I felt I failed, and I'd made it to AAA, and I walked away. I wasn't released. I walked away because there was a strike and we couldn't sit it out in the minor leagues. But it was a dream that, had ended. And the movie was very cathartic. It was a re-embrace of all that. And the book, in a certain way, was going back to my childhood, writing about it a little bit. Obviously, I could write a much deeper, longer thing about that time of my life and how it informed me. But I think the book was also cathartic, because I could connect growing up in a beautiful, supportive home, with supportive parents who were very, I was born in Whittier, Nixon's hometown. And yet Republican parents that were just adamant, vehement about civil rights movement and women's rights. And my dad was a jazz trumpet player. I mean, how different our political parties have become. And then I end up, a little bit on the other side, but very close to people like that and informed by them. So this book helped me sort out how all that informed me. And I don't run from it. I embrace it all. That's who I am, and it's part of my evolution. And how it informed baseball. how they all come together. That's, I guess, what the book's about.
Now, you've mentioned your dear wife, the wonderful actress Lolita Davidovich from London, Ontario, right here in Canada. We're all very proud of her up here, and she's appeared in at least 5 of your movies. What's it like to direct your own wife?
Well, it's great if you can get her out of the trailer, because she's, always working on her hair. And, every actress, you can't get out of the trailer. And so the first and second assistant director, whose job it is to get the actors to the set, they were coming to me and say, Lolita's still working on her hair. She's late to the set. And I go, that's your job. It's my job at home. It's your job on the movie. I can't do it at home. So we get a laugh about it. She's a total pro. So it's fine. It's fun to work together. Honestly, I hope we can do it again.
Now, as you know, this interview was facilitated by our very dear mutual friend, Robert Wagner, who appeared in your movie, Play It to the Bone. He loved your book so much, Ron, that he called me and said, I just had to invite you on the show. And I'm so glad he did. He's a very dear friend of yours, isn't he?
Robert and Jill, yes. We met many years ago, 30 years ago. I only worked with him briefly, but he's incredibly supportive of me and Lolita, huge fan of hers. Our daughter's a young singer, and he's like her publicist. She's very young, but going places. And he's just a class act of all time. I mean, we played golf together many times. He learns everybody's name on a set, everybody's name at the golf course. I don't mean the pros. I mean the workers and the guys out trimming, mowing lawn. He knows their names. How's the family? How's the wife? I mean, RJ, as he's known, is just the model of what a celebrity should be.
Yeah, he's what we call a mensch.
And more, yes.
I'm assuming that RJ told you exactly what he told me, which is that your book should be mandatory reading at every film school. That must be so gratifying coming from such a legendary actor.
Well, I hope so. I mean, thank you, RJ, and certainly the book publisher thinks so. I know the editor of my book was a close friend of Bill Goldman, who wrote the famous Adventures in the Screen Trade, which is the must-reading book for any young screenwriter. And the publisher thinks this should be sitting next to it. So that would be great.
Now, you've mentioned, Ron, that Bull Durham was about loving something more than it loves you back. It must be so gratifying to know that the enduring fondness and affection that people feel for this movie means that you did get all the love back that you put into the film. Thank you so much for taking the time to appear on our show.
Thank you, Harvey, and thanks to RJ for putting us together.
Our guest has been writer, producer, director, and author Ron Shelton, whose book, The Church of Baseball, is now available wherever books are sold. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you to our producer, Steve Silver. A special thank you to the wonderful Robert Wagner for making this interview happen. I love you, RJ. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.